What does it mean to build before there is writing, to encode knowledge in stone, wood, and landscape before there is script or language? This path, traced across the African continent, reveals not a singular origin, but a continuum of cognitive expression where architecture becomes thought and space becomes symbol. This is not a history of styles or cultures, but a logic of emergence. Through the lens of triadic analysis, architecture, symbolism, and cognition, we trace how human beings began to model, project, and manipulate thought in the material world. From early stone circles to monumental urban planning, each site on this path represents a distinct cognitive innovation. Architecture, once the passive frame for activity, becomes an active system of reasoning, identity, and governance. These stages do not evolve linearly but recursively, each integrating and transforming what came before. The African continent thus becomes not just the geographic origin, but the cognitive laboratory in which the foundational tools of human abstraction were first constructed. At the threshold of cognitive architecture, form is not yet symbolic, it is perceptual. In this first stage, spatial organization begins to externalize awareness, grounding cyclical time in simple radial geometries. The environment is not yet interpreted, but it is observed and echoed. This marks the first emergence of spatial cognition as a tool for pattern recognition. Across the elevated ridgelines and open veldt, stone monoliths form deliberate radial patterns, some standing in silent alignment with the rising and setting sun. No inscriptions mark their purpose, yet their orientations speak through repetition. The circle, defined by gaps and intervals, echoes celestial cycles with austere precision. These formations are not decorative but observational, pure spatial expressions of time inscribed in stone. The land and sky enter into silent synchrony, anchoring perception to patterned recurrence. In the first stage, architecture manifests through simple radial and circular formations. These early stone circles embed direct astronomical alignments, encoding the natural cycles of time and space. Geometry and astronomy coexist naturally, and cognition emerges simply through repeated observations of sky-ground patterns. This phase represents the first externalization of perceptual cognition, anchoring early human awareness of cyclical phenomena in the physical environment. Architecture here is a pure expression of recurring spatial and temporal order. At this origin point, cognition begins to externalize awareness of pattern. The circle, drawn in stone, mirrors the cyclicity of the sky, not as myth, but as materialized recurrence. These arrangements do not yet represent, they do not encode, they coexist with the phenomena they echo. There is no syntax, no narrative. But in the placing of stone around a center aligned with solstice or equinox, we witness the first shared external referent. The sky becomes a map, the land becomes a clock. This is not symbolic thought, it is proto-symbolic spatial reasoning, a foundational leap. Time is no longer just endured, it is recognized in form. Space is no longer just occupied, it is structured by observation. Where perception once passively reflected the sky, now it begins to anticipate. Nabta Playa marks a turning point. Symbolic geometry no longer mirrors cycles, it stabilizes and predicts them. This is the moment cognition forms a feedback loop, embedding temporal logic into spatial form. Amid the desolate expanse of the southern Egyptian desert, clusters of standing stones form complex radial layouts, geometrically ordered around solstitial points. These are not casual arrangements but calibrated installations, stone assemblies that register the turning of the sky. The environment is stark, but within it geometry functions as mechanism. These forms encode recurrence not only as memory but as prediction. Architecture here begins to anticipate. Advancing from the initial coexistence of geometry and perception, Nabta Playa exhibits a more structured geometric complexity. Here, radial stone layouts explicitly encode solstice positions, introducing a predictable temporal dimension. The symbolic component, patterned solar geometry, reinforces memory and anticipation. Cognition at Nabta Playa evolves beyond passive observation into active prediction. The arrangement of stones acts as a feedback loop. Architecture now directly supports cognitive anticipation, transitioning humanity from merely observing time to actively forecasting it. The stone circle becomes mechanism. Here, geometry ceases to be a mirror of the heavens and becomes a memory engine. Each alignment serves not just to reflect time, but to predict it. Recurrence is now encoded and observation becomes anticipation. A design feedback loop emerges. As the sky turns, the layout adapts, and this adaptation itself teaches. Spatial logic reinforces symbolic regularity, which then shapes further spatial expression. This is the birth of intentional pattern replication. Time becomes a system. Prediction becomes part of the built environment. Architecture and cognition enter into looped mutual formation. With Last Geel, space transforms into symbolic field. Shelters become sites of narrative logic. Here, cognition takes its first steps into representational abstraction, encoding not just observation but interaction, the foundation of ritual, agency, and social memory. Shallow rock shelters curve inward to enclose walls saturated with color and form. Painted panels depict horned cattle, human figures in ceremonial stance, and interspecies interactions, rendered in vivid mineral pigments. The imagery is both intimate and ordered, arrayed in coherent compositional fields. The geometry of the shelter shapes the narrative space, enfolding ritual scenes within a framed symbolic register. This is not abstraction, it is representation. These surfaces externalize event, intention, and relation. At Last Geel, spatial cognition shifts towards symbolic representation and causality. The rock shelters become architectural canvases, hosting vivid figurative depictions. Scenes suggesting narrative and interaction. Geometry now defines a symbolic field, making possible the representation of cause and effect relationships. Cognition evolves to encode narrative and agentive relationships symbolically. Architecture thus becomes a vessel for theoretical narratives, marking humanity's first attempt at externalizing causal understanding through figurative symbolism. Now, space becomes narrative container. The interior of the cave is no longer just geometry, it becomes canvas. Figurative forms, horned humans, herding scenes, interactions are not decorative. They mark the emergence of causal modeling. This is the first symbolic grammar, not of language, but of image. Here, the world is not only observed, but represented, and in representing it, new relations can be imagined. A ritual, a lineage, a social scene. The cognitive leap is that agency is externalized, and meaning arises not from objects alone, but from their interactions. Cognition becomes narrative. Action and interaction enter the symbolic plane. Space facilitates representation. Cognition now fractures and expands. In the dispersed geometry of Tassili Nadja, symbolism detaches from realism and becomes metaphoric. The linear gives way to the non-linear. Space facilitates symbolic divergence, enabling recursive, dreamlike thought unbound by material form. Across the weathered sandstone escarpments of the Central Sahara, thousands of figures stretch across cliff walls and secluded recesses, abstract beings with bulbous heads, elongated limbs, and surreal compositional logic. The terrain hosts no central focus, only an expansive and discontinuous field of visual fragments. Here, symbolism has departed from the mimetic. Figures drift into ambiguity, forms fuse into motifs not grounded in immediate reality. Space itself becomes the substrate for distributed cognitive experiment, where representation departs from perception. In the vast landscape of Tassili Nadja, symbolic representation diverges radically from literal depiction. The widespread rock art is populated by abstract forms and non-human figures, suggesting dreamlike or metaphorical cognition. Here, the geometry, the diffuse arrangement of artworks across a wide terrain, encourages cognitive non-linearities, allowing abstract symbols to detach entirely from observable reality. Architecture and symbolism now enable the exploration of abstract discontinuous thought, humanity's earliest recorded departure into metaphorical and imaginative cognitive realms. Representation now detaches from realism. The beings on the stone walls are no longer of this world. They are elongated, faceless, fused with abstract motifs. The environments are discontinuous. The logic becomes dreamlike, metaphoric, non-literal, recursive. The terrain becomes the substrate of distributed symbolic experiments. There is no single focal point. Cognition is now non-linear, extended across miles of surfaces. This is not disordered, it is exploratory. The mind no longer just models what it sees, it now models what it conceives. Cognition enters symbolic abstraction. Representation exceeds experience. Space supports symbolic divergence, not just mimetic coherence. From abstraction emerges construction. At Colombo Falls, architectural elements display systemic logic, modularity, interlocking design, and recursive interdependence. The structure itself becomes a cognitive tool, modeling relationships, balance, and design thinking in physical form. Beneath layers of alluvial sediment near the thundering cascade, preserved timber structures reveal an intricate logic of interlocking joints, mortises cut to precise dimensions, planks fitted not by chance but by calculation. These early constructions lack adornment. Their elegance lies in the logic of assembly. Each structural element implies the next in a recursive sequence of balance and constraint. Here, architectural thinking is neither figurative nor symbolic. It is constructive, system-oriented, and self-consistent in design. Colombo Falls signifies a revolutionary shift from symbolic abstraction towards systemic cognitive logic. The site's preserved wooden structures reveal modular, interlocking joinery, a physical manifestation of cognitive modularity. Each architectural element explicitly implies its functional relation within a whole, marking the cognitive leap into structured systemic thinking and intentional design. The interlocking geometry is itself symbolic, encoding structural logic as a physical metaphor. Human cognition here emerges clearly as design-oriented, generative, and self-referentially systemic. Now we enter the domain of constructive cognition. The wooden structures at Colombo are not ritual or representational. They are functional logic systems. Each piece interlocks. Every element implies the whole. This is not symbolic abstraction, but design abstraction. Here, tools do not just shape matter, they shape thought. The joinery system reflects a recursive understanding of structure, balance, interdependence. The act of building becomes an act of systemic thinking. Design becomes cognition. Architecture is no longer symbolic, it is structural logic. Construction becomes generative. Systems thinking emerges. The cognitive field now scales beyond the structure to the landscape itself. At Sungbo's Eredo, architecture operates at the macro scale. Earthworks model boundary, control, and inclusion. The environment becomes a cognitive medium encoding spatial logic at civilizational scale. Stretching for more than 100 kilometers through dense tropical forest, Sungbo's Eredo manifests as a continuous system of deep trenches and high embankments, carved directly into the landscape. From above, patterns emerge, curves, nodes, axial realignments, suggesting an underlying spatial grammar. These forms are not ornamental, they operate at the scale of territory, inscribing control, demarcation, and collective spatial cognition into the very shape of the land. The monumentality is not vertical but horizontal, integrative, and systemic. With Sungbo's Eredo, cognition takes a dramatic leap outward into the environment itself. The immense earthworks and continuous ramparts encode cognitive modeling of territorial boundaries and spatial control at landscape scale. The hidden geometric symmetry and precise architectural scaling reflect abstract cognitive modeling projected onto the environment. Cognition expands to incorporate and manage the macro scale of human settlements and their surroundings, effectively externalizing territorial governance logic through monumental spatial form. The cognitive system now scales. What was once internalized or enclosed becomes landscape forming. The massive embankments of Sungbo's Eredo trace invisible boundaries, making space itself into structure. There is no iconography, yet a profound symbolic logic unfolds. The walls are maps, codes, abstracted borders. They model control, exclusion, inclusion. The cognitive leap is in macro-scale abstraction. Where boundaries once existed in the mind, they are now inscribed on the land. Territory becomes cognition. The environment becomes subject to symbolic modeling. Thought expands across terrain. Realism and identity converge. In Oyo Ife, the symbolic takes human form. Sculptural precision is not art, it is cognition rendered anatomical and social. Identity is modeled, memory is embodied, and spatial placement encodes social presence in harmonic feedback. Set within ordered precincts and ritual spaces, sculpted megaliths and bronze figures appear not as mere representations but as materialized identities. The human face, rendered in cast metal, exhibits refined anatomical precision. Symmetry, proportion, and individualization converge. The spatial placement of these figures, sometimes solitary, sometimes in assemblage, suggests more than aesthetic intent. These are nodes in a representational system, markers of lineage, presence, and embodied memory, where form, position, and symbolism operate in harmonic coherence. Oyo Ife introduces a profound shift: symbolic realism and anatomical accuracy in figurative sculptures. The architectural space now hosts realistic symbolic representations of identity, faces, human figures, that embody social memory and collective identity modeling. The interaction between sculpture placement, spatial logic, realistic symbolism, identity encoding, and embodied cognition, self-awareness, kinship, creates a harmonic feedback loop. Architecture and symbol are interwoven to create powerful cognitive models of social identity, enabling complex self-reflection and lineage consciousness. Now the symbolic returns, but refined, personalized, encoded in human form. The Ife bronze heads are not portraits, they are identity models. Precision, symmetry, idealization. This is the externalization of personhood, not just depiction. The megalithic placement of figures in space constitutes a grammar of social presence. The site models not only the individual, but the collective configuration of memory and role. Symbol, structure, and self enter into harmonic convergence. Cognition now models the self, not just the world. Identity becomes formal. Social memory acquires symbolic body. At Adulis, the symbolic and structural coalesce. Architecture, inscription, and infrastructure become interdependent. This is cognition as system, language, rule, and environment fusing into operational logic. Built space now acts as semiotic engine. In the coastal city of Adulis, ruins of monumental buildings rise from stratified urban foundations, pillared halls, colonnaded streets, and thresholds etched with inscriptions in multiple scripts. Writing appears across architectural elements, integrated into lintels, blocks, and civic markers. These are not discrete layers. Language and structure converge into a semiotic whole. The spatial organization of the city reflects not just habitation, but administration, ritual, and abstraction. Here, symbol and infrastructure operate in unison, forming a civic logic rendered in stone and script. At Adulis, spatial cognition undergoes convergence on multiple levels. Architectural spaces integrate complex inscriptions in multiple scripts, combining language, meaning, structure, and infrastructure into a single, cognitive symbolic system. The city itself becomes a semiotic machine. Written symbols no longer simply record meaning, but directly enact structural and organizational logic. Cognition becomes explicitly infrastructural, expressing itself through built environments that function simultaneously as scripts, structures, and cognitive models of governance and control. Now, writing and infrastructure merge. The built environment and the scriptural environment become mutually embedded. Inscriptions are not passive, they activate structures. Scripts encode function, authority, instruction. This is not symbolic decoration, it is the realization that structure is symbol and symbol is system. The city operates as a semiotic machine where every component speaks to a broader logic of movement, governance, and relation. Symbol becomes infrastructure. Writing becomes operational. Space becomes semantic network. Here, hierarchy enters the built environment. In Mapungubwe, elevation, burial, and goal do not merely represent, they structure social order. Architecture becomes the logic of class, and cognition models social abstraction through spatial symbolic convergence. Atop a steep sandstone hill, elevated enclosures of clay and stone delineate elite space, sharply differentiated from the habitation zones below. Within these upper precincts, gold artifacts and ritually arranged burials reveal a symbolic language of status and separation. The site's topography, modulated by architecture, functions as an instrument of social ordering. Stratification is not implicit, it is engineered. Hierarchy is etched into elevation, enclosure, and symbolic material, forming a tightly coupled code of power, place, and representation. Mapungubwe demonstrates an explicit codification of social hierarchy into architecture and symbolism. The elevated spatial organization clearly differentiates elite and non-elite areas, reinforced through symbolic artifacts, gold objects, burial goods. Here, cognition explicitly models abstract social relations such as status and power, embedding them deeply into physical structures. Without architectural space, symbolic representation loses coherence. Without symbols, spatial arrangements lose meaning. Architecture now explicitly encodes social epistemology, structuring society through clearly defined symbolic hierarchies. Society itself is now modeled in space. The elite occupy the hill. The dead are placed with gold. Every location and object reflects hierarchical logic. Architecture is no longer just shelter, it is coded order. Gold is not currency, it is semantic elevation. Burial is not disposal, it is positioning in meaning space. The site expresses a composite cognition, spatial, symbolic, social. A missing element breaks the whole. Social hierarchy becomes spatialized. Class becomes visible as architectural encoding. Symbolic stratification enters built form. Symbolic and spatial logic now stabilize institutions. Great Zimbabwe encodes governance, rule, and protocol into architectural form. Memory becomes infrastructural. Space carries institutional cognition across generations through recursive spatial syntax. Massive granite walls curve with mathematical precision, enclosing nested spaces whose forms regulate movement, vision, and access. The enclosures are filled with symbolic motifs, chevrons, herringbone courses, cylindrical towers, repeated with formal regularity. These structures are not mere dwellings, they operate as semantic enclosures. Their scale, sequence, and patterning encode institutional presence. Roles, boundaries, and inherited protocols are materialized in their form. This is architecture not of defense, but of structured memory. Great Zimbabwe's intricate architecture of enclosures and symbolic walls extends this social modeling into institutional permanence. Spatial arrangements and symbolic structures explicitly reflect an institutional memory. Cognition becomes embedded as rule and governance within architectural spaces. The arrangement of walls, towers, and spaces encode legalistic or rule-based cognitive structures. Without symbolic architecture, institutions decay cognitively. Without institutional structures, symbolic coherence vanishes. This marks the full materialization of architecture as collective cognitive memory and regulatory structure. Here, all previous threads converge into institutional architecture. The walls do not defend, they demarcate domains. The forms do not house, they represent roles, protocols, limits. The city is a regulatory system in stone. Symbolic motifs, chevrons, towers, are not decorative, they are lexicons. The space encodes rule, memory, role, and circulation. Architecture has become semantic infrastructure, capable of preserving abstract relations across generations. Cognition now preserves its own structure through space. Institution is no longer maintained by people, it is maintained by form. At the apex, division dissolves. At Gebel-Barkal, space, symbol, and cognition are not aligned, they are fused. The built environment no longer represents thought, it performs it. This is architecture as operational intelligence, the full systemization of symbolic cognition. Cut directly into the sandstone cliff, monumental temples at Gebel-Barkal align with cardinal and celestial axes. Reliefs cover the interior walls, not as decoration but as symbolic architecture. Each figure, glyph, and orientation integrated into a larger cognitive order. The geometry is not abstract. It is functional, aligning body, environment, and cosmic logic. Every element, axis, threshold, column, executes an operation in a symbolic field. Here, architecture ceases to represent cognition and becomes its direct material enactment. Gebel-Barkal represents the apex of this cognitive evolution. Total synthesis between geometry, symbolism, and cognition. The carved rock temples, axial alignments, and integrated symbolic carvings reflect not belief, but an active cognitive modeling engine. Every architectural form is simultaneously a symbol, a spatial logic, and a cognitive operation. The site does not merely represent thought, it operates as thought. Architecture and cognition are now fully fused. The environment itself becomes a cognitive architecture, operationalizing human intelligence directly through material form. This stage completes the journey from passive perception of external cycles at Adam's calendar to active cognition embedded directly into spatial and symbolic material systems. At this final stage, the distinction between symbol, space, and thought collapses. Architecture is no longer symbolic of cognition, it is cognition, carved into the cliff, aligned to axis, embedded with relief. The sight is a synthetic cognitive device. It does not narrate, it does not record, it operates. The geometry is functional, the orientation is programmatic. Every form executes a logic. This is architecture as active cognition, a convergence of spatial form and symbolic function into total system integration. Architecture becomes intelligence. Space and symbol are unified into cognitive operation, material and abstract fuse without residue. If this model holds, then the African continent is not merely the cradle of humanity, it is the cradle of mind-made material. The sites along this path are not the ruins of civilizations lost, nor the origins of traditions known. They are the expressions of an entire cognitive order evolving independently of writing, language, or later ideological systems. What this model exposes is not a forgotten chapter of human history, but something more foundational, a prehistorical epistemology, a way of knowing, encoding, and transmitting intelligence that does not rely on script, myth, or lineage. It reveals that long before writing, humans built thought into form. The implications are profound. Architecture precedes language as a symbolic medium. Cognition develops in space before it develops in syntax. Symbolism is not invented, it emerges through recursive interaction with geometry and material. This reframes all subsequent history. It means that when writing finally arrives, it does not emerge from nothing. It emerges into a world already saturated with encoded structure, already shaped by millennia of symbolic architecture and spatial cognition. The script is not the beginning of abstraction. It is the reduction of a much larger, embodied and environmental intelligence. Historically, this places Africa not just at the beginning of human chronology, but at the beginning of abstraction itself. These sites do not represent a developmental lag behind literate civilizations. They represent a parallel cognitive system, one whose sophistication lies in recursive material logic, not textual accumulation. Thus, what has been called prehistory is not before history. It is history of another kind, a material epistemology, in which the building is the book, the landscape, the language, and cognition is enacted, not narrated. This is not a lost world. It is the world's first fully externalized mind. To recover and understand this trajectory is not to glorify the past, but to recognize a different lineage of intelligence, one in which thought does not begin with words, but with stones aligned to the sun, walls that model time, structures that encode systems, and spaces that think. This is the path of the first builders, not of temples to gods, but of forms that make cognition durable, not monuments to kings, but mechanisms for perception, prediction, and integration. In this path, architecture becomes intelligence, and history becomes, first and foremost, the history of how human beings made mind into matter.